In horror, we are presented with the most despicable monsters committing the most gruesome acts. Chainsaws rip, knives slash, jaws devour, and teeth gnash. At times, the horror is born out of the seeming lack of rationalization. Why would someone do such a thing? How could we let this happen? With no answers, we are forced to look beyond the limits of reason and appeal to madness. Other times, the horror originates in the source of desire itself. That is, monstrosity here is seen in fulfilling a desire that goes against all decent expectations. In Jonathan Demme's 1991 masterpiece, The Silence of the Lambs, we are confronted by an intersection of competing desires and rationalizations. Clarice Starling, a young, ambitious FBI agent, desires a respected place in her agency and the capture of Buffalo Bill. Hannibal Lecter, the deranged cannibalistic psychiatrist, desires control, a good meal, and a nice view. And Buffalo Bill desires a new skin and relief from their gender dysmorphia. While, according to Christina H. Hodel, Buffalo Bill was originally read as the quintessential queer as monsters, can we read this as a story about the horrors of transphobia that pervert reasonable desires? What can we say about the motive behind each of the characters' actions?
In Osgood Perkins' 2024 film, Longlegs, we have a much clearer sense of motive in a classic The Devil Made Me Do It tale. Much like Lamb's Clarice Starling, Lee Harker is a young and ambitious FBI agent with an intuitive penchant for solving clues while pursuing a white male big bad. At the heart of the film is a confluence of satanic worship, uncanny dolls, and secret accomplices. Mirroring the gender duality at the center of Buffalo Bill's dysmorphia, the audience is pulled by the dualistic tension between body and spirit in Longlegs. What controls the desires of the people involved? The mind of the devil. What accounts for the horror is faith in the devil that evades reason. After all, what is more terrifying than the forfeiture of one's desires for the will of cosmic chaos? So, grab your badge and join us as we follow the cryptic trail of evasive mass murderers. I heard there will be a party at the end. Just avoid the fava beans and chianti and put the lotion in the basket. This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Jeff Stoyanoff.
And I'm Brian Onishi. We're two professors celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. All right, y'all, welcome back. Welcome back to Horror Joy. We are here. We're going to be talking about two really interesting movies today. First, we're going to start out with The Silence of the Lambs, classic masterpiece film, incredible, 1991. Jonathan Demme directed it. Yeah, there's so much to say about this movie. I'm not sure we're going to be saying anything new about it just because there's so much that has already been said. We're going to then jump into Osgood Perkins' 2024 film, Longlegs, which got a lot of attention. I think that the marketing strategy for Longlegs was actually really incredible. Like, there was so much hype for this, and I was in on the hype. I was excited for this. Nick Cage, I think Nick Cage not being in the marketing was actually kind of part of why it was so interesting. What's he going to be like? You never know. You never know what you're going to get with Nick Cage. And so we're going to talk about Longlegs. It has been compared to Silence of the Lambs a lot in its very short time while it's been out. And I think there's something worth talking about there. So I guess we'll just jump into it. There's so much to say, Jeff. I of course want to hear what you have to say. But right, so Silence of the Lambs, we have Clarice Starling. She's this young FBI agent. She's still in the academy. She's working her way up and seems like she's really bright. And she wants to move up in the agency. And she is able to kind of crack some of the clues for a case that's ongoing. Buffalo Bill is out there and he's skinning women alive. Like it's gruesome, right? And while this is happening, they think that one way that they can find out who Buffalo Bill is to consult a well-known psychiatrist, Hannibal Lecter, incredibly smart, brilliant, but also a cannibal. So there's that. I don't know if that's a drawback for anybody looking for a new psychiatrist out there, but yeah, Hannibal Lecter, cannibal, right? So there's this, I think there's so many interesting dynamics going on here. Obviously, we got a young Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling. you can see the kind of gender dynamics, power dynamics at play all the time. It's pretty gross in some instances. Fast forward, we get Longlegs, right? Again, I think we'll talk a lot about the similarities and differences, but we also get this kind of young FBI agent, very much like a little bit of a mirror of Clarice Starling. I don't think we get the same gender dynamics, right? We don't get the same sexism, at least not explicitly, that we do in Silence of the Lambs, so we can talk about that. But there's this kind of different approach to what we're doing here. I think one of the big differences for me is like, okay, we have this very grounded, I don't know, crime drama, psychological horror maybe, but it's clearly very much rooted in the material world in Silence of the Lambs. In Longlegs, we get a different version of this. We get something like a devil made me do it kind of tale, where what we're seeing is a motivation that is satanic, and it calls to a kind of spiritual world. And I think that that's something that we have to reckon with, whether or not we, what do we do with this, right? So I don't know. There's lots to say here about dualism, about sexism. I want to start with Silence of the Lambs. Jeff, you have mentioned, at least to me, off the, I don't know, what we're saying, outside of our recording sessions, that you have watched this a lot. You like this movie a lot. This is one that I remember watching, probably too young. And also, I'll say this, like, so young that there's a scene where Clarice is walking down to talk to Hannibal Lecter, and she's walking back, right? The session's over, and she gets something thrown on her face, and I didn't know what that was. Have you seen the movie? If you remember, it's not good. But I didn't know what that was. That's how young I was when I watched this. I don't know why I was watching it, or why I was so naive maybe when I did watch it. Who knows? Maybe I was 25. I don't remember. But all that to say, I want to hear your thoughts, right? Because I rewatched this recently. I think it's incredible. There's something so compelling about all of the characters that are in this movie, the kind of three characters that really drive the story forward. But I want to hear your first thoughts here about Silence of the Lambs. What makes it so compelling? Why is it such a classic? And if there's any kind of, anything you want to say about, any of it, right? I think one thing that is highlighted for me, of course, is Buffalo Bill's gender dysmorphia and what's going on there, how it's being used in 1991 versus how we can read it here now in 2025 versus what we're seeing in politics in the United States and what we're seeing as the prescription for thinking about this kind of stuff. So Jeff, I'll throw it to you. Tell me about Silence of the Lambs, your experience of it, your thoughts, your ideas. What do you got?
Yeah, I mean, like we've talked off air, I'm a huge fan of this movie, despite some of the problematic subject matter that gets brought up. I mean, our conversation, I think it's worth acknowledging that the film has been criticized for potentially playing into transphobia, much in the way some other horror films of the late 80s and early 90s have. Maybe to go there quickly, there's an article in Vox from 2021 by Aja Romano called Understanding Silence of the Lambs, Complicated Cultural Legacy. 30 years after its debut, the classic horror film's influence is so much bigger than Hannibal Lecter. And I think for many of us, Hannibal Lecter is the way in for Silence of the Lambs. But Romano here in this article does a nice job of discussing some of the complicated gender or trans dynamics that are happening in the film. There's just one paragraph here I want to read to help situate Silence of the Lambs within maybe the larger moment of the late 80s and 90s, the 80s and 90s in general, really. So when Silence of the Lambs came out in 1991, it followed many other horror films that had problematically portrayed transgender and cross-dressing characters. Films like Psycho, The House with the Laughing Windows, Dressed to Kill, and Sleepaway Camp. Universally, those films depict queer and genderqueer identity as either synonymous with evil or as the reason for the villainous character's deviance. Parenthetically, then, Romano notes the LGBTQ horror community has since reclaimed some of these films, reinterpreting them through transpositive lenses, while still acknowledging their problematic aspects, though transphobia continues to be a pernicious horror film trope, as in 2013's Insidious Chapter 2. Listeners might recall that we had similar conversations in our episode with discussing trans issues in horror. And also we got into it a bit with S. Trimble in that episode, talking about the Babadook and the like. To say it's complicated might be oversimplifying it, but in many ways, like it's just complicated. Like it's art is complicated. Art needs sometimes to be discussed, whether it's film or poetry or visual arts or whatever. Like there are going to be interpretive strategies that we can try to read generously and say this was not the intent. And there are going to be ways that we can read, I don't want to say ungenerously, but critically, and say that this potentially is a problem with this film. And maybe we ought to consider how highly we regard it. And for me, like as someone that works in queer studies, this is an ongoing tension with Silence of the Lambs. I do love this movie. I love the book series as well. I think Thomas Harris's books on which the films are based. So Red Dragon being the first, Silence of the Lambs being the second, and then Hannibal being the third. And the one that he wrote like 20 years after Hannibal, like Hannibal Rising or something, is awful. Like in the movie based on it is worse somehow. But Silence of the Lambs, like it is a great movie for a number of reasons, but I think the primary reasons are you get to see Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins acting on screen together, two actors at that time who were maybe for Foster not quite the pinnacle of her career, but close to it, and Hopkins definitely like at the pinnacle of his career. He brings to life a character in Hannibal Lecter that would have otherwise seemed run-of-the-mill, like just psychopath. There's a gravitas to Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter. He's terrifying, but also charming. He's ruthless, but also kind and sweet at times. The conversations that he has with Clarice Starling and understanding who Clarice is almost immediately are really disarming. And I think we see Clarice Starling as a character in this film dealing with that. So these are some of the gender dynamics, because you talk about how, like at the FBI Academy, how it's Clarice and her friend, whose name I'm forgetting right now. I'm going to scroll down here real quick. Do we get her? Ardelia? Ardelia. Yes, Ardelia Mapp is the other female, one of the only female Academy students along with Starling. We see their bond, but the way Starling has to interact with most of the men around her, whether it's Jack Crawford, her boss, or Dr. Frederick Chilton, the like just oily, gross worm tongue of a character at the Baltimore asylum or penitentiary, wherever it is that she's interviewing. And then the men during some of the scenes in West Virginia, where she's going through the autopsy of one of the victims, when they find the pupa for the first time of the little moth thing that sort of gets them on the trail of what all this means. They don't treat her with respect. She has to like, yes, sir. And she has to very much like act almost like a second class law enforcement person in this role. Lecter doesn't talk to her that way. Lecter like goads her a few times trying to like talk to this way, but yeah, you have that going on. So that relationship on screen, to me, like just to watch it, I've seen it so many times, I think I could probably recite most of the lines, but it's a mystery too. Like it's a horror film, it's a mystery film, it's a thriller. There are a lot of things going on. IMDb does not qualify or categorize, rather, Silence of the Lambs as a horror film. Again, like this is something Brian and I've talked about a lot on this show, but there are so many movies, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that do not call themselves horror because it is viewed as a genre that is like a tier below the genres that are meant to be popular, meant to be award-winning, meant to be something that are critically acclaimed. So the story that we follow in Silence of the Lambs, with Clarice Starling trying to essentially catch Buffalo Bill, so James Yum, I think is our character's name here, who is harvesting skins from young women to make a skin suit because he seems to have some type of gender dysmorphia, even though Lecter does say in the film that he's not a true transsexual. How he knows that, I mean, he was a psychiatrist, so I assume that's how he knows that. But when the directors and the writers come out later and try to say this was not supposed to be part of some kind of like transphobic panic or like a transsexual panic, I mean, I don't know, like when the impetus for the entire movie is this guy's harvesting skins from women and he wants to potentially be a woman, like it rings a little hollow to looking back later and be like, yeah, we weren't trying to be transphobic at all. We just thought that like it was kind of an interesting story that this guy was cutting the skins off of women and trying to make himself a woman, and really kind of misunderstanding gender dysmorphia entirely, because like that's like sorry, but like if you would go and poll most of the idiots in the Republican Party who are highly transphobic, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Lauren Boebert, like any of the jackasses who are just the run-of-the-mill white conservative men, like our local Congressman John Joyce, they'd say the same thing. They'd be like, yeah, I mean, that's just a guy that wants to be a woman and therefore is going to try to put on women's clothes, and that's a cross-dresser. And, they'll use all sorts of terminology that's just outdated and antiquated and offensive. So the movie, it does that. It does that in some ways. I think it is asking us a lot of questions about morality in the sense of like that relationship between Starling and Lecter. I think it's in some ways looking at policing and in some ways that could be slightly radical for its time period. It's definitely playing on the horror of using a monster to catch a monster. And this is a question that I think see offered in a lot of books and a lot of films, like which monster do you trust? Which monster will you use to get where you're going? So Brian, I'm going to toss it back to you, I think, to see to see where you are finding or locating a lot of the horror in this film.
Yeah, I think it's weird when we start to classify and categorize horror or try to come up with conditions for the possibility of horror, whatever necessary conditions are required. There's always going to be something that breaks that mold, right? And I think that the horror at play here is the tension so clearly in gender across the board in the film. And so I think it's so it pulls at this tension so much, right? And in many ways a very sophisticated way. And yet I have a quote here from the director that it makes it feel like he didn't really understand how complex this was, right? So he says, this was in an interview done close to the time that it came out. He says he wasn't a gay character, talking about Buffalo Bill. He was a tormented man who hated himself and wished he was a woman because that would have made him as far away from himself as possibly could be. I don't know, right? So going off what you just said, this idea that, oh, this isn't some kind of transphobic image seems off to me. And really it seems as though somehow there's like this complex gender dynamic in the film. There's a lack of understanding of what's actually happening in the characters themselves. And so I think you've talked about, as a English scholar, right, the difference between the things that we read and how we read them and the author's intent, right? So maybe we can get back to that at one point. But some of the things that I think are so compelling here. So I read The Filleting of Gender and Sexuality in the Silence of the Lambs by Christina Hodel, mentioned it in the cold open. But Hodel really pulls out this kind of complexity in the gender, right? So she says, due to her own gender inversion, as a woman striving to succeed in a violent, traditionally male profession, Clarice and Buffalo Bill are opposing images, and their respective views of their gender and sexuality make it difficult for Clarice to understand and so capture him. Thus, she requires a mediator, the brilliant sociopath Hannibal, the cannibal Lecter. Right, I think that there's something really interesting. So when we talk about the horror, the audience in 1991 is being presented with something that is outside of the realm of possibility or the realm of rationality. And so I think that's the confrontation, right? The horror that's being presented at the time. A woman who's in a strong role, who is able to kind of just brush off all these like implicit and explicit sexual advances. That's something, right? That's a confrontation with one's own masculinity that is probably a horror for a lot of people. So in another interview that was given, again, close to the time that this was released, Demme, right? What does Demme say? Sorry, lost it here. Demme goes, having a strong female lead was unusual at the time. It just broke all the rules. So again, we have this idea that we get Lee Harker and Longlegs, which we'll talk about. It's not atypical anymore. It's actually fairly typical. But for Demme, he's saying this was actually something that was breaking rules. And I think that there's something horrific there. But as a way to highlight what we're seeing in Buffalo Bill, right? The horror of being confronted by a trans woman or what's taken as a man desiring to transition may have been horrific at the time, right? Again, this is like breaking those boundaries in some way. And I think that that's compelling. I also think a couple of things you said here, the way that it's actually treated in 1991 and the way that we can think about it now, I think, right, this is the work that we're doing. Again, Hodel, this is from Hodel. She says, Bill's gender is likened to a costume or a masquerade that through violence becomes more defined. Such a portrayal perpetuates the stereotype that those with gender dysmorphia are profoundly disturbed and tending to an obsessive pursuit of narcissistic, even trivial ends through horrifically violent means. And again, I think that's exactly what you're saying about politicians right now, right? And that they would see people with gender dysmorphia, they would see the trans community as perpetuating a kind of violence. Why are we so afraid of the trans community reading to children? Why are we so afraid such that there are bills that are being introduced whereby people are going to check the genitalia of athletes in order for them to compete? Like, I think what we should be doing, and I hope, I think the scholarship is doing this, I want to hear your thoughts about this too, is to flip that script and say, what's horrifying, right? We've talked about this before. We talked about it with T. We talked about it with Eric LaRocca. We're flipping the script and saying, what's actually really horrifying is the background that allows for this to be the horror, right? So when you're confronted by the trans community and you say, that's a danger, without any actual material evidence that there's any danger there, when the opposite is true, what we're seeing is that so many people who present as cis, hetero, white, male, especially, right, are perpetuating sexual violence. We have Andrew Tate coming into the country again. We have Matt Gaetz. We have, I mean, we can list all of them on and on and on. Our president, like all of these people have been shown to be violent in a sexual way. And it's not the trans community, right? So here we get an image of, again, a perverted understanding of maybe somebody with gender dysmorphia, but like you're saying, maybe just a really poor understanding of what that means. And I think now we can kind of see that as the horror. So that's where I'm seeing the horror. Want to hear your thoughts about some of that stuff. If you are finding horror in other places, I think we think of gender as a costume. We can think of it as play, but when it becomes like I don't know, we're imagining that it's just perpetuating violence, this becomes very problematic. So anyways, want to throw it back to you. What do you think? Any more thoughts about Silence of the Lambs here?
Yeah, so I think it's a good point to think about play and costume. I'm thinking back to like Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, where she talks about gender is performance. And gender's performance, like, this isn't just a trans issue. Gender's performance even for men. Like there's all sorts of masculinity one can perform. You can perform masculinity as like, oh, hey, bro, I'm a jock. I'm Joe Rogan's biggest fan. You can play a more intellectual masculinity. So like maybe a Noam Chomsky, I don't know. You can have a more effeminate masculinity that might not necessarily you're homosexual. It might just mean that your masculinity is a more effeminate version of it. The same with femininity. Femininity has all sorts of ways in which it can be performed, and so that there are, according to our president, there are two genders now. So he said that. I mean, his masculinity performance is generally orange shit given. I don't know that that's one that in the books yet, but maybe if there are any gender scholars out there listening, you can take that. Just put me in a footnote somewhere. The masculinity of orange shit given. I want to come back to something you said though about how thinking about the time period in which this film is being made, it's 1991, don't necessarily have as complete an understanding of gender. And like, this isn't to critique what you're saying here. I think that this is in some ways the excuse that we give for why it took, it's 2025 now, and I think transgender rights really only maybe hit full stride maybe 10 years ago, if that, maybe 5 years ago. Maybe we're still in it because we haven't achieved it. We haven't achieved equality for our trans sibling, this world, or non-binary folks, not the same, obviously, but equally persecuted. The reason I say this is because I think back to some of the work that I do in medieval drama studies. And as early as like the late 90s, there were academic critics of medieval drama asking questions about like, is there trans potential to be discussed in these plays, which was revolutionary at the time. But now like people look back and speak to it and say that wasn't enough. And I think like we're in a very similar conversation here with this film. So like in the late 90s, Robert Clark and Claire Sponsler published an article asking, can we think about in medieval drama? Because like in Shakespeare studies, that's something like that's a given, where you have all male actors playing female roles, et cetera, et cetera. Just at the end of 2024, Colby Gordon published a book, Immaculate Bodies, I think is what it's called. I'll have to double check on that, where he really takes Sponsler and Clark to task, saying like it's kind of transphobic in their article to discuss like inspecting genitals, which is exactly what we have politicians doing or wanting to do. The transphobia that we're talking about when we have politicians who want to inspect genitals is really just another version of the same eternal misogyny that we've had in this country and in Western culture really since forever. You'll notice that politicians aren't concerned about trans men in men's sports. It's only trans women in women's sports. And last night at whatever that debacle was, the joint Congress session address, Trump, of course, invited some Division III volleyball player who had her nose broken and some sort of brain damage from apparently, I mean, I don't know the full story, so maybe I should even speak to it, but a trans woman playing against her spiked the ball in her face. And of course, the reason is, well, it's because it's really a man that did that and not a woman. And this is the line you hear from all sorts of women's sports advocates. And it's like, this is not an either or. It's a false dilemma, essentially, is what they're creating. They are creating a problem where there is not a problem. It's just another culture war narrative that's meant to drive between people and to make people adversarial rather than coming together with the shared reality that they have. So sorry if I got a little off track, but I think that with this film, we have the benefit of hindsight. Even without the benefit of hindsight, I think this film is just representative of a culture that took entirely too long to really understand how gender is working and how it should not be an object of horror per se, other than people who are feeling gender dysmorphia. Like that can be a horrific thing for them. And it might be more horrific soon because they will be unable to get the gender affirming care that they should be granted. The other type of horror, though, that I would think we should think about in this film is the psychological horror, because obviously like there's the blood and the guts. There's the ways in which like Hannibal Lecter magnificently flays one of the guards in Tennessee when he's about to be transported. We can talk about mask because like he wears the one, I mean, like Lecter himself is wearing a flesh suit. It's just another guy's flesh suit. So there's something there. But the psychological horror of this film, to me, is also one of the driving reasons that I come back to it time and again. It's the fear of not knowing. It's the fear of identifying with monsters too. I think we see Starling doing this, like where Starling doesn't actually say out loud that I'm not like you to Hannibal Lecter, but you can almost, I mean, you could insert that line at numerous points in the movie and it would totally fit, because she is very much like a kinship with Lecter, but at the same time horrified of that kinship. So Brian, I spoke way too much there about, maybe got a little off topic, but I want to like see if you're seeing these psychological horrors as well.
I mean, no, there's definitely psychological horror going on. And I think one thing that I thought about while I was watching it is, and even in our conversation here, this has come up, it seems as though Clarice Starling is not seen by lots of people in the FBI, maybe by her friend, right? But but for the most part, she's not seen as a subject. She is seen as an object. And in many ways, that's the way that we're seeing Hannibal Lecter, right? He's an object too of scrutiny, but certainly we're seeing Buffalo Bill as an object of scrutiny. And so I think when she engages with Hannibal Lecter and Hannibal sees her, that can be horrifying, right? When somebody sees you and acknowledges your existence. But on the other hand, right, that can be incredibly freeing, and that can be, it can be great when somebody finally sees you. But being seen is also a revelation of yourself, and it's also therefore a vulnerability of yourself to another person. And I think, like you're saying, the seeing herself in Lecter, that's a horror, but seeing ourselves maybe even in any of these characters is also part of the horror, right? If we take up their desires, and certainly not to the extent that they're doing it, but if there's any kind of sympathy with Lecter, do we get pulled in? And then we get shown ourselves. I think there's something there. I want to point out that Gender Trouble came out in 1990, so that's like very close to when Silence of the Lambs comes out. This work is being done. I think, like you're saying, right, I certainly don't want to justify the way that this was used as, certainly it seems like we can read it as a kind of transphobic image, Buffalo Bill. It's really unclear maybe what's happening there. But all that to say, right, there's work being done at that time that should have allowed us to have a better picture and a better critical kind of picture there. I think there's lots to say here. We haven't really touched on Lecter's cannibalism. I saw some people trying to connect Silence of the Lambs to Frankenstein, right? What Buffalo Bill is trying to do is to create out of the disparate bodies of other people some new thing. I don't know if that's something that we want to talk about. Again, I saw another person trying to imagine Lecter as a kind of vampire, right? A psychic vampire, maybe stealing something from Clarice. I don't know. So I think maybe there's like, it's either we open this back up or we close it down. And I think we've said a lot, and I'm not sure that, if it's worth kind of poking around those corners. So what I will do is I will say that I think I've had my final thoughts on Silence of the Lambs. I think we could talk about cannibalism if you want to. I will throw it back to you and say, do you have final thoughts, or do you want to move on to Longlegs? And if so, we can do that. Otherwise, I mean, I'm happy to keep kind of fleshing out, as it were, our conversation on Silence of the Lambs. So what do you think, Jeff? Final thoughts here on Silence of the Lambs?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's more to talk about with Silence of the Lambs, right? Like it's not as popular as it remains for nothing, as they might say. Something that you were saying about the way in which like Lecter could be a psychological vampire, or, I mean, the cannibalism thing is of course like horrifying, and I think we'll come back and talk about cannibalism another time. But one of the things that he really sees about Clarice too, and that I think this might be a good segue into Longlegs, is there's an element of class horror in Silence of the Lambs, because Starling comes from poverty, near poverty at any rate. Her dad was a sheriff and he gets killed at some point, and then she's tossed around, or has to like live with an aunt and an uncle or something to that effect. And this is where the whole title of the film comes, like hearing the lambs crying and yada yada. But there seems to be this part of her where she wants to prove herself, because she does not come from means in any way, shape, or form. And that, I think, resonates maybe now with a lot of us in 2025 than it did even in 1991, given the economic disparities that we're seeing in this country now compared to then. In Longlegs, to transition maybe into that, I got a really similar feeling. I don't know, like the Lee Harker's mother, Ruth, that house when we go back to, like, it's very, very hoarder-esque. There's so many visual parallels between Longlegs and Silence of the Lambs that I think it's really hard to watch these two movies and not think of the other. I don't think Longlegs is doing what Silence of the Lambs is doing at all. And I think you have a lot to say about that. So I'll turn that over to you here in a minute. But I do think the visuals are meant to make viewers associate Longlegs with Silence of the Lambs. And maybe in some ways that makes Longlegs seem to be a better movie than it is at first blush, because I don't think it's a great movie. I think it is trying to be in the, like, it wants to take up the mantle of Silence of the Lambs, you might say. It wants to be this next crime psychological horror film where we have all of these elements going on. We've added a religious element. We've added this uncanny element with dolls. we've added like the psychic connection between the parts of the dolls and almost like a voodoo or voodoo element there too, but with like these pasty white people, whiter than me for fuck's sake. And then you have Nicolas Cage in, if this were a true parallel, would be Buffalo Bill figure. And I know you and I might have had this conversation around when the film first came out, but is Nicolas Cage supposed to be gender ambiguous, or is he just this weird long-haired man who was a doll maker? Because I mean, I'm just thinking about the way in which he's made up, the makeup and the way in which like he is portrayed, and the very high-pitched voice. There seems to be something effeminate there. I don't know if that's intentional. I don't know if that is at all, again, a nod back to something that in 2024 would surely have been something we shouldn't be doing as a filmmaker. So maybe that's something that Perkins should have been thinking about. But yeah, like I'm seeing all those parallels. I just think like they are shot similarly. They are, the tone, the vibe, if as the kids say, is very, very similar in both of these films. So I wanna, Brian, ask you about what you're seeing in Longlegs. Because before recording, you talked about dualism, and I think that's a super interesting way to come about this film, among other things. So I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, I have a lot to say. I like I said earlier, I got kind of swept up in the hype, went to see it, and I don't think it really lived up to the hype. Watched it again recently for this episode, and I think that it fell flat for me, right? Longlegs, I think I'll say this about Osgood Perkins. Visually, I think he's a good visual stylist. Visually, I liked the movie, and there are some atmospheric aspects to the movie that really worked. My worry with Longlegs, and I think this is where it really fell flat for me, is when you introduce another realm. So here, are we supposed to accept that there's this spiritual realm in which the devil or Satan exists and is motivating people to act in ways that they would otherwise not act? I don't know. But once you introduce that, I think you really have to flesh out the logic of how that works. And if not, then you have to make it not important. And I'll point to The Monkey, Osgood Perkins' most recent movie, as I think more successful because it leans into the comedy, and there are some like supernatural object kind of things going on, but the mythology doesn't matter as much because it's just not as important. In Longlegs, if we were to accept that there is a Satan and that Satan is driving people to do things, I think we have to flesh out the mythology a little bit more, right? So, in part, that's where I want to start. Is like right. So there's a duality that's set up in Silence of the Lambs, right? We can even make this kind of claim where what we have is, if we have a dualism in Silence of the Lambs, we always set up one part of the dualism that's the standard of normalcy, and the other side is the deviant, right? And so there's lots of ways that plays out in Silence of the Lambs. Law enforcement, law and order versus those who break the law, right? The criminal, right? So we have this dualism there, or certainly the way that gender plays out. And so there's this kind of dualism there. In Longlegs, the dualism seems to be about the material versus the spiritual. And so we get these uncanny images of mothers and fathers acting not in a caring manner, but in a violent manner. That's the uncanny showing up. Children being creepy, dolls especially, right? Dolls, if nothing else, is I think the quintessential, we've talked about this before, the quintessential kind of image of the uncanny is the doll. It's acting out of its nature. It's doing things that we wouldn't expect. It's animate when it shouldn't be animate, etc. It just feels mythologically flat to me. Like none of that actually matters. And I think that the comment about Nicolas Cage, right, the Longlegs character, the kind of gender performance of that character, I think maybe there's something to say about how, like, yeah, we talked about in the 90s that in that era, this shows up as something very important. and maybe this is a positive about the atmosphere in which Longlegs was released. His gender performance, I think, matters much less, in the sense that like that doesn't show up as the deviance, right? It doesn't show up to me as the horror. There's something uncomfortable about looking at Nicolas Cage with his kind of very puffy face and his very chapped lips and his very starchy clothes. Like it's unclear what's going on. But right, for me, that doesn't hit as part of the horror necessarily, right? I want to throw it back to you here. A couple more things that I just want to say is like, so again, what falls flat for me is that the mythology seems to fail. It's a flat mythology. I'm not convinced that the devil made me do it tale is actually very important right now, right? There's not a lot of scholarship out there for Longlegs because it just came out, but I read this Substack article by Angelica Jade Bastian, and it's just called Longlegs Exemplifies American Horror's Inability to Speak to the Moment. And one quote says, bluntly speaking, who is truly scared of this shit? I'm not talking about the fleeting pleasure of a jump scare or the kind of lewd grossness that makes you uncomfortable. I mean the kind of scare that stays with you, that froths to the surface of your mind in the lonely dark. The kind of horror that is boldly entertaining but sneakily obsessed about commenting, toying with, or considering a genuine fear that exists out there in the world of ours. I think that gets to it for me. I just don't think Longlegs is getting to an anxiety or attention that's important to me. In fact, right, we've talked about Christian nationalism a great deal. It's not Satan that I'm worried about. It's the Christian nationalists that are pretending like they're Christian when in fact they are perpetuating the exact opposite. And so and we also have this kind of, I don't know, emergence of the Satanic church or whatever as a political actor, acting in ways that I think are interesting and good for the Commonwealth of the United States or whatever, right? And so like the devil made me do it stuff, it just doesn't do it for me. And it's not as interesting as the devil character in The Vitch, right? So lots more to say about that. I think there's also this is the last thing I'll throw it to you. My comment here is that there are times when we're supposed to think that Longlegs is like really scary. And is he just scary to the little girl? Because he goes into the hardware store and he's like, he's being all creepy and weird or whatever. He's acting kind of, strange to the teenager there. And the teenager just like gives him the side eye and is like, Dad, this dude's weird. And it seems to deflate him. Now he's just driving along in a station wagon. He's just like a sad dude on the road. And the whole image of him deflates. We never get that with somebody like Hannibal Lecter. We don't even get that really with Buffalo Bill. There's a sadness there maybe that we can take up with, but I don't know what's going on with Longlegs. I don't see it. And so, yeah, I'll throw it back to you. Sorry for just continuing to talk there, but yeah, I want to hear your thoughts.
No, I think you're right. I don't think this movie's scary. Like, I think we want it to be scary. And so like we're trying to create a possible story in which these characters could be scary. I'm still not quite sure why he's called Longlegs. Like I know that it's kind of discussed, but that mythology is not built out well at all. I think you're 100% right that this movie is trying to, like, something like the Satanic Panic is still current, and it's not. Like, this movie is not set in the past, if I'm recalling correctly. It's set more or less in present day, right?
Set in the 90s. There are many images of Bill Clinton's portrait in the FBI office. So yeah, it's set in the 90s.
All right. So again, like, maybe another parallel to Silence of the Lambs where it's trying to fit into that era of police work and whatnot, but it gets that wrong too. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It should be set in the 70s really. Like if it's going to do Satanic Panic and then it's going to play on some of these themes the way in which it does with doll making and whatnot, because you wouldn't really have doll makers in the 90s either at this point. I think that the idea of a doll maker being a horror figure is interesting. I think maybe we could read Longlegs aesthetics as almost like a doll-like human. Maybe that's where the starchiness is coming from. Maybe that's the puffiness of the face and the sort of long straw-like hair, even for a male doll, right? It's weird, right? Because the way the film starts with the clairvoyance bit with Lee Harker in the past, and how that is a subplot or like a thread that guides us throughout the film, they don't play on that nearly well enough. Like, I think there could be so much more there that would be so much more interesting than what we get. Longlegs is not scary. Maybe, like, to try to overread the scene, perhaps, maybe there's something to be said about the horror is the fact that for some viewers, oh, freaks like Longlegs wouldn't have dared show their face in public when I was a kid, or, back in my day or something. We would have beat the snot out of that person. There never would have been an opportunity for them to exist. So maybe, I'm not going to accuse Perkins of trying to present us with some weird, super toxic masculinity type of horror, but maybe that's part of what we're getting here. Maybe if we just killed all the freaks, we wouldn't have to worry about our kids. That seems really unproductive, and that seems really dated for a 2024 film. The author, whose name I'm forgetting, that you quoted from Substack.
Bastian.
Okay, Angelica Bastian. I think I'm going to assume pronouns are she, her. She makes a really compelling point that American horror does not its moment. I was thinking as you were reading that back to like the last film that I would say really understood its moment, and it might have been Get Out. Like we don't have great political horror that's being made now. Arguably some of the religious horror we've talked about could be responding to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. The substance with body horror is always timely, particularly given the irony that Mikey Madsen defeated Demi Moore for that Oscar, Demi Moore was robbed. I'm sorry. Honora was fine. Mikey Madsen's great. No disrespect to her. Demi Moore was better. That's just ridiculous. And again, ironic. But with Longlegs itself, maybe Perkins is trying to play on nostalgia for viewers who would be of the age to have been kids back in the 90s when something like this could have been scary. There's so much mythology. Again, I'll come back to it. There's so much mythology that could have been built around this film, that could have been built around the character Longlegs, that could have made Longlegs legitimately scary. That's just not there. And instead, we spend a lot of time with dolls that have weird titanium type hearts or something that Longlegs, as the doll whisperer, whispers into, that's not ever fully fleshed out or explained. And then we have a mother who's a religious zealot, but in fact, somehow reminds me more of a Christian nationalist than a Satanist, to come back to your point about Christian nationalism, because that's the way those folks act. Satanists in real life, you don't see taking guns and going around and murdering people in this way for reasons, like for undisclosed reasons. Like it's all, again, like the more I'm talking through this, I'm beginning to worry that we have like a very conservative horror movie at this point, because the other thing that drives horror in the film are outsiders breaking into your home, are people who don't look like you and don't act like you coming into your neighborhood trying to sell you things, because that's how the doll thing works, right? And then she disguises herself as a nun. Like I just, yikes, man, yikes. So I guess I'm gonna turn it back over to you, because I've worked myself into a bit of a analysis paralysis. I don't know what else to say about this movie at the moment.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple more things I want to say. In terms of the mythology, there's this like T-Rex business, right? So I like T-Rex, and like, I don't know, we could have done more with T-Rex. Is that something going on there? I also was really intrigued by the writing, right? The little kind of symbols that Longlegs uses, and that
yeah,
just
like
kind
a
of
Zodiac killer
disappears.
thing. Yeah, exactly.
And then he just sneaks into her house and gives her the cipher, and that's it. Right. There's that's also part of this. Like, there was never a following the clues. I, as the audience, was never like, ooh, like this is another clue. I'm trying to figure it out alongside Harker. It was never that smart. And maybe that's not the point. That's fine. We'll leave it there. I do want to call out Dawn Keatley. We've talked about her before in her work. She wrote a very brief article on Horror Homeroom, which is her website. She has a podcast as well called Horror Homeroom Conversations. Recommend it highly. And she argues that Longlegs is a folk horror film. And the reason why, she says that there's a presence of a fabricated folklore. This is from her, grounded in James Frazer's The Golden Bough. That shows up quite a bit if you can find it. Like, Longlegs in the basement is reading The Golden Bough, whatever. And there's a presence of magical effigies, like you talked about in terms of voodoo, right? These dolls. There's a handing over of agency to the dolls, right? So it's a devil made me do it. I didn't do it. It was somebody else doing it. And then there's the presence of the illegible, right? The symbols that we get. And for me, it fails, right? If that's true, if that's what we're going to accept as the kind of logic of the movie, it's a folk horror film, I think it fails, right? And that's why I think the mythology aspect of it is where it falls flat for me. Okay. So beyond the like folk horror stuff, which I think Dawn Keatley's making a good point, and she is at the forefront of scholarship on folk horror. So I want to believe and think that Dawn has a smart take on this, right? I accept that. I just think it fails. The second thing I want to talk about a little bit is like the Satanic Panic. I reread an article that I really like. This is an article by Mary Jane Rubenstein. It's part of a volume called Entangled Worlds, but she's writing about the great god Pan, and she maps out this history that I think is really interesting. And maybe you as a medieval scholar have some insight here, but she basically maps out this idea that Pan was at one point taken as a shepherd and at another point taken as a symbol for everything or the universe, right? So Pan is used as a reference to like, right, all things, pandemic. But here we have panic also, right, as part of this. Pan as a goat god, right, is now the image that we tend to get for Satan, and it's the image that we get in Longlegs. But Pan is also at one point was taken as a Christ figure. So there's a story that's told, and this is where Rubenstein kind of takes this. She says there's a story that's told where there was a death, right? And somebody proclaimed the death of the great god Pan. And at one point, it was the death of pagan religions, ushering in the Christian era. And at another point, it was the death of God, the death of Christ, who would later be resurrected, right? Taken as all. Okay, this is just an interesting thing for me, right? But I think that in the Satanic Panic, what's interesting again is we get the panic aspect of it from Pan, but we also get this goat image from Pan that Osgood Perkins uses, and again, I think unthoughtfully. I'm just not sure. We get these, I think I didn't even notice them the first time that I watched it, but we get these like fades in and out with this devil image. It happens in the library. She looks out and there's a devil. When she goes to her boss's, I forget the boss's name, played by Blair Underwood. I actually think is great in this. When she closes the door, you see the image of the god, of the Satan, whatever, the image of the goat person. I don't know. I'm not sure if there's anything there, but I really like this idea of thinking about Pan here as nature, right? Pan as both Satan and Christ at the same time somehow in these stories. Pan is everything pagan also. Like all of these stories get wrapped up into this one image, and here I think maybe Osgood Perkins is using it a little bit unthoughtfully. Final thing, and this is where I will throw it to you for maybe your final thoughts here. Is Longlegs an image of, I don't know, childhood trauma? Is it, right? So that first shot, we get that kind of weird aspect ratio of the flashback shot. When we first see Nicolas Cage as Longlegs, we only see his chest. And he says, "It seems I wore my long legs today." And then he kneels down, right? And so I just wonder if there's something about the levels that he's using here of interaction between adult and child, right? He makes the images out of the child. The doll maker is making images out of the child. Is it, and we also see that Harker seems to be very flat affected. She doesn't make eye contact. Is she on the spectrum? I don't know. Again, that feels a little bit unthoughtful also in this movie. But is she also just kind of a result of childhood trauma? The woman we see in the mental institute, Is she just dealing with childhood trauma, right? Finally, Ruth, the mother, acts as a nurse from the Catholic Church, bringing in a doll, won as a prize. Here, right, is this a kind of critique, a criticism of especially the Catholic Church and the scandal that happens there, the pedophilia that happened there, probably still is happening, I don't know, as a insidious infiltration, right? Where the Christian church in Christian nationalism now is acting as somebody bringing you gifts, but in fact is just infiltrating your basement as the Satan, as the Antichrist, as whatever, right? So maybe that was just a bunch of stuff. I think the most generous reading that I can give to Longlegs is that there's this insidiousness that just infiltrates under the guise of the innocence of children and the church. And maybe even medicine. I don't know. Like, people need medicine. You can't get medicine in rural areas. Here we are. I'm a nurse. I'm giving you something for free. Maybe we should be skeptical of that already. Anyways, I will throw it to you for final thoughts on Longlegs. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say in your conversation there, which all of which is very smart, is that this film is trying to put too many elements in it. I do like the idea about Pan. I do think that's compelling to think about how Pan could be a symbol of both Satan and also potentially Christ. Through this film, then, like, does Lee become a Christ-like figure in the sense that she kind of has this dualism herself, where it seems that part of her subconscious or part of her consciousness even has been cut off from the magic whispered into these dolls over the course of the years. So there could be something there. Childhood trauma, like, I mean, I guess we could read it that way, but I mean, the more we talk about this film, man, I don't know. Like, I'm getting some really uncomfortable conservative horror vibes, like Sound of Freedom type things, where like the horror of this film is child trafficking, and you should be afraid of your children because there's a cabal of liberal, communist, like evil people who are going to come and steal your children, even though, I mean, the data would not bear that out in any way, shape, or form. Maybe there's like some grooming elements here where she's been groomed to be the way that she is. I think Lee Harker as a character lacks any of the chutzpah, if you will, that Clarice Starling has. Is this because of the trauma? Potentially. Is this because part of her soul, part of her is missing, like, or blocked? Is it because she's on a bunch of drugs and essentially catatonic? Also maybe. So I just, again, like, I see all these parallels between it and Silence of the Lambs, like, where it's trying to make us think of it in the same, and we're doing an episode, so I guess we are. Like, it's trying to make us hold it in the esteem of Silence of the Lambs, and I just don't think it's nearly as good of a movie because it does not fulfill any of the expectations that it sets up. Thinking about it as folk horror, I mean, that's really interesting. And as you say, Dawn is an expert in these things, and I will yield to her. I don't know if the Golden Bowel's the keystone that we should be looking for in folk horror, and like other than those moments, right? Like, the setting doesn't evoke folk horror. I don't see folk horror in the way that we might see it in The Wicker Man or some of the other more classic tropes, or even Blair Witch Project, which we talked about a few episodes back, and some like Old Gods. Like, I see a movie that might be trying to use elements of folk horror. I see a movie that's trying to use elements of religious horror. I see a movie that's trying to use elements of Satanic Panic, crime horror, and psychological horror, and magic horror, and maybe at the end of the day, that's the problem. Like, where this film ultimately doesn't deliver on what it promises and what it advertised as bizarrely as it did. Oh, and the Zodiac Killer too. Sorry. Like, I know you mentioned that, but like, there are entire movies just based on the Zodiac. Like, and this film uses it as a throwaway plot point where it's like, hey, there's a cipher. You know what's going to happen? Longlegs is going to break into Lee Harker's house and leave her a birthday card. And in the birthday card, he's going to give the answer to the cipher. And then, like, she's reading all of these things, and she knows what's going to happen, and she's on the trail, and she's such a good detective, even though Legs, and like, maybe she was supposed to be a detective all along. Maybe this is a horror of free will. And like that she was, because of a childhood trauma, because of some magical spell that Longlegs cast on her, working for the man downstairs, which I guess is Satan. Like, or he lives in tenement housing, like we all are going to be living soon enough. And like, we're just talking about our downstairs neighbor, Mr. Jim. Who knows? Yeah. I just don't
But
know.
even thinking about hell as like underneath us, I think it just feels theologically bereft and unthought out. The man downstairs, but again, like is it like it just insidiously creeps into your basement? And are we just supposed to get the evocation of the creepy basement image?
It's like radon, man. It's just down in your basement.
I don't know. Yeah. I think the more I'm with you, the more I think about it, the less I find appealing. I didn't mean to jump in and take what you were saying. I think that stylistically, atmospherically, Osgood has something. And I think, again, I'm going to appeal to the monkey and say that there's something fun about the monkey. He does a good job telling a good story. And when the mythology kind of just doesn't matter as much, which I take the monkey to be, then it becomes more interesting and a more successful horror movie. Here, the mythology is important, and it feels unthought out, and lacks depth. Right, the thing that I thought about Silence of the Lambs is this fully fleshed out, like deep world? Longlegs thrusts us into a style. I'll go back to Angelica Jade Bastian. She says the performances reveal this to be a film that only cares about surfaces. It isn't a wholly bad movie. It's too purposely crafted and carefully braided to be bad. It's just an airless film. And I think that's right. So anyways, again, I jumped in and want to give you your final thought space. So if you have any final thoughts on Longlegs, let's close this out. I don't know if we want to find some joy. Let's do that too.
Yeah, we should find some joy. No, I mean, I kind of where I was getting is just a little bit exasperated by the film. Like I want it to be better than it is. I think that there is enough surface here, if you will, or like there's enough inspiration in the character of Longlegs, the way at least in which I'm perceiving it, given like the marketing and how the movie begins, to have more than one film. And maybe Perkins' problem is he's trying to put too much stuff in one film. And if you maybe let this be more of a slow burn over, I don't know, 2 films, 3 films, you can tell the story more fully and better than rushing it. And because it does feel like remarkably rushed. And the entire character of Longlegs, we meet him only to have him kill himself by beating his head off of an interrogation table, which, I mean, you can tell. So joy, transitioning into joy. Nick Cage was having a fuck ton of fun in that scene. That man is like, there is never a man who is enjoying himself more than Nicolas Cage when he is being an absolute weirdo. And so to me, that's joyful. Like seeing Nick Cage in that scene, it was joyful on one hand because I'm like, man, Nick Cage is so good at being weird. But it was not joyful because I was like, what the fuck? They've already killed Nick Cage. You can't do this to me. Like the entire premise of this film is this Longlegs guy who should be creepy, should be like the Babadook, should be like something that has beyond just, yeah, he's a doll maker. Weird guy that drives around in a station wagon. Like, you know, might have cast a spell or some sort of voodoo on my daughter. And well, anyway, so would you like a doll? Bring it to your house. And I'm a nun. Not really, but you don't need to know that. My daughter thinks that I'm a shut-in agoraphobe hoarder, but in reality, I'm out doing the bidding of this. Because like that's a plot we didn't discuss either. I know I'm jumping out of joy here for a moment, but like we didn't even discuss the mom's like the turn where apparently she's a bad mother for a long time, but at the very end, she's like, no, I'm actually going to be a good mother. Like, well, what is happening in this movie? The joy maybe is when it's over. There's some joy. Silence of the Lambs, I mean, again, despite its problems and its latent transphobia, I love that film. I think it is one of the first movies that I consciously would consume over and over and over again. Just like wasn't always on TV, but like I had a DVD of it that I've just watched and watched and watched because I'm so fascinated by the film and a very full mythology there. Like I think that whereas Longlegs has a mythology it doesn't take advantage of, Silence of the Lambs builds just a really excellent mythology. And again, it's based on Harris's book, but there's just so much there to explore and that feels left unexplored. And there's just little elements throughout that you find that are great. And even if it is in its ways. I think there's something important about us addressing those things and using it as an object lesson in how we shouldn't think about gender and we shouldn't think about gender performance. So that to me is joyful. I guess our like off the rails ish mystery science theatering of Longlegs is joyful in its way. I mean, again, like I love the idea of Longlegs, and I love horror movies like this. Like I think this could have been such a really good movie and so interesting, and it's just not. And that's not great. But I do find it joyful to contemplate what we could have done with it instead of what it is. So, Brian, joy are you finding in Longlegs and Silence of the Lambs?
Yeah, I agree with you that watching Silence of the Lambs again was joyful for me. I love movies, right? I love watching movies, and if you watch a well-made movie that's well paced and the suspense is built and the characters have depth, and like you were saying earlier, incredible performances, right? These are incredible performances that we got to see, given space, patience, that I think sometimes we don't get to see anymore. Anthony Hopkins, Jodie Foster, Jonathan Demme, they all won. You know, we just watched The Substance get nominated for lots of things, and it didn't win, except it did win Best Makeup. So it is an Academy Award winning film. But Silence of the Lambs cleaned up, right? Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Screenplay, I'm pretty sure. Cleaned up. And it's a really well-made movie. I think that there's some joy for me in getting to uncover some of the biases that we see in the film, talk about them in our perspective now, but also to acknowledge that we probably have blind spots, right? That we are not seeing. And in 35 years, what are we going to be saying, right? That we missed. I think there's something joyful for me about that, because there's always the process of trying to figure out our own blind spots. And there's something there for me. I just watched True Detective Season 4, where, of course, Jodie Foster plays another law enforcement officer. And it was a lot of fun to see, right? Kind of closer to the beginning of her career and the end of her career. I mean, she's not done, clearly, but more recently, she plays a very different kind of officer character, right? That was joyful for me to kind of see that. There's always joy in seeing Ted Levine, who plays Buffalo Bill, because I mentioned this to you off air before we started recording. He's also the captain in Monk, and he plays this, like, talk about gender performance. He plays this very masculine, mustachioed police officer man. And like the contrast and goofy, right? And also you can tell that he's like just being goofy. Like seeing these two things, you know, together, seeing Ted Levine play, and his voice is so distinctive that like you cannot not know that that's him. That I find a lot of joy in that. Longlegs, the marketing was great. Like that was the most intrigue for me. There are some scenes in there that are great. I love some of the scenes, like the scene where she goes outside of her house and she's investigating things and she gets a birthday card or whatever. The mythology fails, but the atmosphere is great. And I love a good atmosphere. So I will say that I continue to think that Osgood Perkins is good at building atmosphere. The mom stuff is weird, but when Lee finds a collection of her teeth in the mom's like collection, I don't know, there's something really funny about that, because being a parent is so weird, and you're just like, your kid's teeth fall out and you go, what do I do with these? Do I throw them away? Do I flush them down the toilet? Do I make my own dolls with them? I don't know. I'll put them in a drawer. What do I do with them? I have no idea. And so there's something joyful about, like, that is horrific, but again, horrific in a everyday kind of way that you're like, what do I do with my kid's teeth? I don't know. It was nice to see Alicia Witt back. I haven't seen Alicia Witt in a long time. I like Mike and Monroe. Like, the cast is great. I don't know. There's a lot of joy to be had there. I do wish that there was more mythology, and I think that there's also joy in saying, hey, let's dig deeper into the mythology. Anytime I get to talk about Mary Jane Rubenstein's discussion of Pan, also some joy. So Yeah, I don't know. We did a lot of good work, I think, today. We talked about Silence of the Lambs, talked about dualisms, talked about gender dysmorphia, what's happening with Buffalo Bill, the successes of Silence of the Lambs and the failures maybe of Longlegs, and also some successes too. Dawn Keatley is still writing. I think it's supposed to come out soon. Her article that touches on folk horror in Longlegs. I think I'm excited to look for that. Hope you all found some joy in this. Maybe you disagree with what we said about Longlegs, and maybe disagreed with what we said about Silence of the Lambs. Reach out, tell us. But for now, seek horror, even enjoy. See you next time. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.